The CEO tossed worthless spare parts at a single dad. He built a racing team with them. There were 41 boxes, 41 gray plastic crates, stacked along the back wall of Meridian Motorsports' receiving dock, each one stamped surplus, disposal authorized in faded red ink. Inside them, crankshafts that had never been torqued to spec, brake calipers pulled from development cars that never raced, a turbocharger still in its original foam casing, 3 partial gearboxes, engine components worth, by any honest reckoning, somewhere north of $200,000. And Renata Voss, Meridian's CEO, had ordered every one of them thrown out. The man standing at the loading dock was not a Meridian employee. He had no lanyard, no title. He wore a gray canvas jacket with a frayed left cuff, and standing beside him, clutching a small stuffed fox with one ear slightly flattened from being slept on too many times, was a 6-year-old girl named Cora. Renata Voss looked at them both from the top of the dock stairs. She looked at the crates. She looked back at the man. Elias Holt? It said on the work order, temporary facilities crew. And she said, loud enough for the 3 department heads flanking her to hear, "Take the trash, all of it, and next time leave the child at home." What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that Elias Holt had built a turbocharged V6 from salvaged parts in a rented garage when he was 22. That he had spent 6 years as a lead powertrain engineer at one of the most respected racing programs in North America, before the accident, before the funeral, before the apartment with the cracked kitchen tile that Cora had named the lightning bolt, because it ran all the way to the wall. What she did not know was what he was going to build with those 41 boxes. Stay with this one. It earns it. The morning it happened was a Thursday in late October, and the Meridian campus was the kind of cold that makes metal contract. The type of cold that engineers in high-performance environments track carefully, because metal that contracts unexpectedly fails in ways that are quiet and catastrophic. Elias Holt had arrived at 6:40 in the morning, signed in at the facility's desk, and started his day the way he always started his day at contract jobs. He walked the perimeter first, not because he was required to, because he liked to know what a place was actually made of before anyone started performing for him. Meridian Motorsport was impressive on the surface. Glass atrium, carbon fiber wall panels in the lobby, a reception desk that looked like it had been designed by someone who had watched too many Formula Paddock Garage reveals, and not enough actual racing. But Elias had learned a long time ago that the most honest version of any operation lived in its loading dock, its storage bays, and its disposal records. And what he had found 3 weeks into his facility's contract was that Meridian was bleeding. Development parts ordered in quantities that exceeded any plausible testing program. Components signed out under project codes that didn't correspond to any active build. Inventory flagged for disposal that, in several cases, had never been used at all. He hadn't said anything. He wasn't there to say anything. He was there to mop floors, move equipment, and pick up Cora at 3:15 from Whitfield Elementary, where she was in Mrs. Parrish's class and currently engaged in a weeks-long campaign to convince her teacher that her stuffed fox, whose name was Sable, was an essential educational tool and should be allowed at the desk during reading time. Cora had a point, Elias thought. Sable had been present for a lot of reading time. He couldn't argue with the results. He'd had Sable in the truck that morning because Cora had insisted. And Cora had come along because it was a teacher professional development day. And Elias had no one to leave her with. Not since Ellen. He did not think about Ellen too often anymore. Not because it hurt less, because the hurt had changed shape. It had become something he carried, rather than something that stopped him in hallways. Ellen would have known, he thought sometimes. She would have looked at those 41 crates and known immediately. Renata Voss came down to the loading dock at 9:15. She had two department heads with her. Marcus Fell, head of procurement, who had the look of a man permanently waiting for a piece of bad news, and a younger woman named Adrian Park, who ran development operations and had the slightly pained expression of someone who had been in the meeting where this decision was made and had lost the argument. Behind them, at a respectful distance that was actually not respectful at all, was Dominic Carew. Dominic Carew was 47, silver-haired. He wore a watch that Elias recognized as a model that ran to about $14,000, new. He had the particular stillness of a man who has learned that other people's discomfort is most useful when you're not visibly causing it. He was Meridian's head of strategic partnerships, which was a title that, in Elias's experience, usually meant the person holding it was either the most important person in the building or the most dangerous. And in Dominic Carew's case, he had spent 3 weeks trying to work out which one. Renata had issued the disposal order the day before, 41 crates, surplus from the TD7 development program, a project that had been quietly wound down after a series of dyno results that hadn't matched projections. The parts were to be cleared from the receiving bay to make room for incoming equipment from a new sponsorship deal. They were to go to a contracted recycler. They were to go today. What Elias had done was ask, quietly, through the facility supervisor, a good man named Terence, who asked no unnecessary questions, whether any of the crated components were available for personal acquisition under the company's standard employee salvage policy. Terence had asked. Renata had been told. And Renata, in the middle of a Q4 budget review, with 3 board observers in the room, had made a decision that was less a decision and more a performance. Let him have them. Give the janitor his trash. She said it with a small smile. The kind of smile that is not warm. When she arrived at the dock at 9:15, Elias was already there with a flatbed cart, organizing the transfer. Cora sat on an upturned crate near the wall, Sable the fox pressed against her chest, watching with the focused attention that 6-year-olds bring to things that adults seem to think are complicated. Renata looked at Cora. She looked at Elias. She said what she said. Take the trash. All of it. Leave the child at home next time. Elias did not respond. He moved 1 crate onto the flatbed. He checked the packing slip against his own handwritten inventory. He moved a 2nd crate. Adrian Park looked at the floor. Marcus Fell checked his phone. Dominic Carew watched Elias with an expression that was almost interested. Cora held Sable a little tighter and said nothing, because she understood, in the way that children who have learned to read rooms understand, that this was not a moment for speaking. The garage at 14 Kellner Street had been Elias's for 11 months. It was a double-wide commercial unit at the end of a row of 6, sandwiched between a tire retread operation and a man named Gerald, who restored vintage motorcycles and played the same Hank Williams album every Saturday morning loud enough to be heard through 2 sets of cinder block walls. The lease cost Elias $460 a month, which was, he had calculated carefully, the maximum he could commit to after rent on the apartment, Cora's school supplies, and the grocery budget he tracked in a small notebook he kept in the truck's glove box. The garage had a workbench along the left wall, 3 sets of steel shelving along the back, and a hydraulic floor jack he'd bought at an estate sale for $40, and spent a weekend rebuilding. Above the workbench, fixed with a single nail, was a technical drawing, pencil on drafting paper, the kind of drawing you make when you're working something out, when the idea is still more feeling than fact. It was a schematic for a turbocharged inline-4. Ellen had drawn the initial proportions for him back when she was still doing graduate work in mechanical engineering, back when they used to argue pleasantly about cooling efficiency over dinner. He had never built the engine in the drawing. He had never quite been able to start it. But he looked at it every time he came into the garage, and it did something for him that he hadn't been able to fully name. So he had stopped trying to name it and just let it do its work. The 41 crates arrived in 2 loads. Elias drove them himself, the truck bed riding low both trips. Cora in the passenger seat the second time. Sable buckled into the middle position because Cora had decided that was the safe choice, and Elias had not argued. At the garage, he unloaded each crate himself. He opened every one. He inventoried every component by hand, cross-referencing against the disposal manifests he had photographed before signing them over. What he found was better than he had hoped. Not trash, the opposite of trash. The crankshafts were ground to tolerance. The brake calipers were development spec hardware from a European supplier that Meridian had switched away from for contract reasons, not performance reasons. The turbocharger was a unit that had been pulled from a test car after a sensor fault, not a mechanical failure. The sensor was a $40 part. The gearboxes were incomplete but compatible. 3 of the 4 had synchronizer packs that were worn, which was a known issue with that generation of unit. But the cases were straight, and the gear sets were clean. He sat on a crate in the quiet of the garage and looked at what he had. Cora was asleep in the passenger seat of the truck, sable tucked under her chin. He thought about something his old department chief at Vantage Racing had said to him once. In a different garage, a different city, a different life. Walter Briggs. 63, crew cut gone white. Hands that looked like they'd been assembled from replacement parts over the course of several decades. Walter had said, Elias, in this sport, the difference between a car that wins and a car that doesn't isn't usually money. It's whether the right person was paying attention. He looked at the crankshafts, at the turbocharger in its foam, at the drawing on the wall. He picked up a wrench. He worked at night, mostly. After Cora was asleep, after the bedtime routine, the glass of water, the 3 stories of which Sable was always a supporting character, the particular way of tucking the blanket that Cora had once described as the burrito method and which had remained mandatory ever since. Elias would drive the 4 minutes to the garage and work until somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, depending on what he was in the middle of. Terrence from Meridian Facilities stopped by in the 3rd week. He came on a Saturday afternoon, no particular reason stated, and stood in the garage doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at what Elias was building. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, I knew a Walter Briggs, back when I was doing crew work for a regional series. Good man. Elias looked up from the workbench. He knew I was here, Terrence said. Briggs. He knew you were here. Didn't say anything because you weren't saying anything. But he knew. Elias put down the caliper he was holding. He said, Did he say what he thought I was building? Terrence smiled. He said the parts. He said, only one person who'd know exactly what those parts could do together. Elias nodded. He picked up the caliper. Terrence said he'd be back Saturday, if that was all right. The trouble at Meridian announced itself quietly, the way serious mechanical trouble usually does. Not with catastrophic noise, but with small, wrong readings that accumulate until someone who knows what they're looking at stops and pays attention. It was Adrienne Park who noticed first. She brought the first anomaly to Marcus Fell on a Tuesday. 2 project codes in the development budget that she couldn't reconcile against any active build. Marcus looked at the numbers, told her she was reading the allocation wrong. She went back to her desk. She looked at it again. She brought it back. By the time it reached Renata Voss, 3 weeks had passed and the anomaly had grown. It was not 2 project codes. It was 11. It was not a misread allocation. It was a pattern, a systematic pattern of component orders, external consultant fees, and materials signed out under TD7 project codes that had been active only on paper, maintained just long enough to make the procurement look legitimate. The amounts were not small. By Adrian's calculation, which she had by then spent 4 nights verifying. The total was somewhere between $700,000 and $1.2 million, depending on how the external contracts were valued. The paper trail, when Adrian finally spread it out in its entirety across the conference table on the 14th floor, printed because she did not trust the building's shared drives anymore, led in one direction. It led to Dominic Carew. But Dominic Carew was also the man who had spent 8 months cultivating Meridian's most significant incoming partnership deal, a sponsorship arrangement with a regional racing syndicate that would bring $4.8 million into the company's development program over 2 years, a deal that was being announced in 11 days. A deal where Dominic was the named relationship holder, the only person in the building with the partnership contact's personal number, and the only person who had attended the 3 preliminary meetings. Renata was in a position she had been in before in her 18 months at Meridian's helm. She could see a problem clearly, and she could see that moving on it too quickly, without certainty, without evidence she could defend in front of the board, would destroy something she could not afford to destroy. She needed the TD7 program data. She needed the original development records that would confirm or deny Adrian's paper trail. And those records, the physical originals, signed and stamped, from the engineering phase of TD7, were in the crates she had given away to the facility's contractor, with the frayed jacket and the 6-year-old daughter. She sent Marcus Fell. Marcus found Elias on a Wednesday morning at the Kellner Street garage. The door was open. Inside, on the central floor space, was something that Marcus Fell, who had been in automotive procurement for 19 years, could not immediately categorize. It looked like the early stages of a race car. Not a kit car, not a restoration. Something built from components, different generations, different origins, that had been made to speak a common language through the particular intelligence of whoever had assembled them. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Elias looked up. He said, "You're from Meridian." Marcus said yes. He explained what Adrian had found. He explained about the TD7 records. He said, "The CEO would like to know if the physical documentation came with the crates." Elias wiped his hands on a shop rag. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The documentation came with the crates." He crossed to the steel shelving along the back wall. He pulled out a flat archival box, the kind you use for paper storage, acid-free, lid-fitted. He carried it to the workbench and set it down. Inside were the TD7 engineering records, original drawings, test data, sign-off sheets, materials certificates, and at the back, rubber-banded to a secondary folder that had been tucked into the base of the crate, which Elias had found on the 3rd night of inventory, and which he had set aside, and which he had spent some time understanding. A set of internal approval documents, requisition forms, signed approvals, Dominic Carew's signature, on 6 separate procurement orders, under a project code that Adrian Park had already flagged as non-existent. He had not taken them to anyone. He had not reported them. He had found them, understood what they were, placed them back in the archival box, and continued building his engine. He was not there to say anything. He was there to build. But here was Marcus Fell, from Meridian, asking. Elias looked at the box. He looked at Marcus. He said, "I need to be there when this is opened." Marcus said he'd make that call. The call came back at 11:40 the same morning. Renata Voss would see him at 2 o'clock, bring the documentation. Elias picked up Cora from school at 3:15. The meeting had run long. He had walked into Meridian's 14th floor conference room at 2:03. Terence had met him in the lobby. Terence, who had not been invited, who had come anyway, who stood near the door with his arms crossed, while Elias set the archival box on the conference table. Adrian Park was there. Marcus Fell. 2 people from the board Elias didn't recognize. Dominic Carew, At the far end of the table, very still, with the watch and the silver hair, and the stillness of a man waiting to see which way a room was going to move. Elias opened the box. He laid the TD7 records out in order. He explained, in the same flat voice he used for most things, what each document was. He was precise, not angry, not satisfied. He explained what the sign-off sequence meant in terms of engineering authorization, because he had spent 6 years in rooms exactly like this one, signing documents exactly like these, and he knew what a legitimate approval chain looked like, and he knew what this was not. Dominic Carew said, "This is being taken wildly out of context." Elias did not respond. He put a requisition form on the table. He put the corresponding purchase record beside it. He put the materials certificate beside that. He had done this 6 times. Each time Dominic's signature. Each time a project code that didn't exist. At the 5th set, Dominic Carew went quiet. At the 6th, Adrian Park looked at Renata Voss and said, "That's the one I couldn't reconcile. That's the one I brought to you in September." The room was quiet. Not the quiet of nothing happening, but the quiet of a room where everyone had stopped pretending. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s, Eleanor Marsh, who had said nothing until this moment, said, "Dominic, I want to hear your explanation for Document 6. Dominic Carew had no explanation for Document 6. He was escorted from the building at 3:47 in the afternoon by 2 members of Meridian's legal team and a senior HR officer. The partnership contact, the one with the $4.8 million deal, would later confirm, when reached directly by Renata's assistant, that he had never met Dominic Carew personally and had, in fact, been corresponding for the past 4 months with a man operating under a false internal title. The deal was still available. It required a new relationship holder. Dominic Carew had not been building a partnership. He had been building a story. Renata Voss found Elias in the lobby at 4:15. He was signing out. He had a copy of the documentation, his copy, his right as the person who had provided it, in a folder under his arm. She said his name. He stopped. She said, "You found those documents 3 weeks ago." He said, "I found them on inventory night 3. She said, "Why didn't you bring them to us?" He said, "I wasn't asked." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I called you worthless spare parts," he said. "You called the crates worthless spare parts." "That's different," she said. "I owe you an apology." "A specific one," she said. "I dismissed you in front of my department heads. I made a joke at your daughter's expense in front of my team. I made a decision about your value before I had any information about who you were. And I was wrong to do that. Not wrong because of what you know. Wrong because it was wrong." She said it clearly. No deflection. She looked at him, and she said, "I was wrong, not I'm sorry if you felt." Elias nodded once. He said, "All right," she said. "What are you building?" he told her. "Not everything. The outline, a car, a team. Something small, regional, first season, to see if the components spoke to each other the way he thought they would. A single car entry in the regional development series starting in March." Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The TD7 program was canceled because the dyno results didn't match projections." She said, "Those results were logged by Dominic Carew's team." She paused. She said, "I don't actually know if those results were accurate." Elias looked at her. She said, "If you wanted access to a dyno, our dyno, to verify what you've built, I could make that happen," he said. "I'd need a full day," she said. "You can have 2. He picked up Cora at 4:48, half an hour late, from the after-school care room where she had been sitting with Sable in her lap. Completing what her teacher reported was a very detailed drawing of what appeared to be a racing's engine, labeled in Cora's careful 6-year-old handwriting. "Dad's car, almost done." In the truck on the way home, Cora asked if everything was okay. Elias said yes. He said, "Something that was broken got fixed today." Cora thought about this. She had Sable in her lap, the fox's flat ear between her fingers. She said, Did someone break it or did it just get old? He said. Someone made a choice that broke it, but the parts were still good. Cora nodded. This made sense to her. She had a way of accepting complicated things straightforwardly. It was something that reminded him of Ellen, sometimes, sharply enough that he had to take a breath and look at the road. He made eggs and toast for dinner. Cora ate with Sable, propped against the salt shaker, which was their usual arrangement, because Sable liked to be part of things. The dyno day was a Saturday. Terrence came. Adrian Park came because she had asked and Renata had said yes, and because Elias suspected she had never fully stopped being an engineer, and she wanted to see what he'd done. The engine, the one built from 41 crates of disposal-authorized trash, ran on the first attempt. Not perfectly. There was a mapping adjustment needed, a fuel trim that was slightly off, and a harmonic at a specific RPM range that Elias addressed by swapping a bracket he had originally sourced from the third gearbox casing. But it ran. And on the third run, with the mapping corrected, it produced numbers. Adrian Park looked at the dyno readout. She looked at it for a while. Then she said, "These are better than the TD7 projections." Elias said, "The TD7 projections were wrong. The components were right." She said, "They were our components," he said. "They were going to a recycler." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I voted against the disposal order. I want you to know that." He looked at her. He said, "I know." "You looked at the floor." She blinked. She said, "You noticed that?" He said, "I notice things." Cora came to the second dyno day. Renata Voss came to the second dyno day. She had asked if it would be appropriate, and Elias had said it was his time. She could use it how she liked. She arrived at 9. She wore a jacket instead of the suit. She stood near the back and she watched. She did not perform being impressed. She just watched, quietly, in a way that Elias found he had more respect for than he'd expected. At mid-morning, during a break, Cora had drifted across the floor with Sable under her arm. The fox looking slightly battle-worn after several weeks of being an essential support element in a garage environment, and she stopped in front of Renata Voss and looked up at her. Renata looked down. She crouched, not to get something from the floor. She lowered herself to Cora's height, and she crouched there on the garage floor in her good jacket, and she said, "Hello," Cora said. "My dad built that from the stuff you threw away." Renata said, "I know." Cora considered this. She held Sable a little closer. She said, "That means you helped." The garage went quiet. Terrence looked at the floor. Adrian Park put down her clipboard. Renata Voss stayed crouching. She said, "I didn't mean to." Cora said, "That's okay. Sometimes the best help is an accident." The proposal came in writing, which Elias had asked for. Not a job offer, not a contract. A partnership arrangement, jointly structured, in which Elias Holt's team, operating as an independent entity under his own name, would have access to Meridian's test facilities, technical support, and, contingent on performance, a development partnership entering the following season. The arrangement had one non-negotiable term, which Elias had added in the margin of the first draft in pencil, and which Renata Voss had initialed without asking him to explain it. The term read, "All work schedules are secondary to school pickup at 3:15. The car ran its first competitive lap in March, which was still months away, which meant there was still work to do. There was always still work to do. That was not a complaint. That was the nature of building something from what you have. On the drive home from the second dyno day, Cora fell asleep in the passenger seat before they'd reached the main road. Sable was buckled into the middle position. The heat was on. The night was cold in the specific way of late-season cold, the kind that makes metal contract, the kind that engineers in high-performance environments track carefully. Elias drove. At a red light, he looked at the frayed cuff of his jacket, at the notebook in the glove box, at the drawing he would put back above the workbench when he got home. Pencil on drafting paper, Proportions in Ellen's handwriting along the margins. The engine that had taken this long to finally exist. The light changed. He drove. Behind him, in the dark, Cora was asleep, with one hand resting on Sable's flat ear, breathing slowly, the way she always breathed when she had decided the world was settled enough to let her rest. He turned onto Kellner Street. The garage light was still on. It was always still on. There was still work to do. He parked. He sat for a moment. Then he got out of the truck, careful with the door, and went inside.